Here's Pradia. So there's one other person that made it in. I don't know why this didn't connect up first. Can you hear me?
I can hear.
Okay. Okay. Well, guess what I don't have is page 1. How about that apples? Okay. Okay, yeah, unfortunately, okay, share the screen. And we want writing of New Testament 22. And we want to enlarge this so it's much more visible. Okay. And we can go out here a little bit further. That ought to work. Hey, can you see that now?
I can see it, yes.
Okay. And this document and one other should be hiding in your email. If you are in such a place that you could print it out and write notes on it if you wanted to.
Okay.
I discovered it didn't go when I sent it earlier, so I resent it, but just a few minutes ago.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't bring the list in here, but I won't have a hard time remembering if this is all who makes it in. Tonight we were going to look at the writing of the New Testament, which is somewhat less complicated issue than the writing of the Old Testament.
Yes.
Because there's much less time involved.
Mm-hmm.
The Old Testament, you're talking about 1,000, maybe even 1,500 years.
Yes.
With the New Testament, you're basically less than 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not more than 60. Certainly no more than 75. And that means there's far less room for there to be gradual development and revision and compilation and all that kind of thing. You're still in what the sociologists consider an oral or a verbal culture. Writing is still as much for recall as it is for basic information, except for short stuff. Obviously, the Greeks and the Romans have created literature just for reading. So there are more people who are commonly able to read and to write. It's not an exclusive club of scribes anymore, but the basic business and culture of the day is still tremendously dependent upon oral transmission. But the New Testament appears very, very early. one of those interesting turns of scholarly thought. The book of John is considered to be the one written of the four gospel records, the last. And in the days of first critical consideration of New Testament material, it was pretty much an early opinion that it's a document of the mid-second century, probably 150, maybe even a little later, possibly a few years earlier than 150, but not much. Well, then as it turns out, the oldest scrap of biblical text we have found is from the book of John. By a whole variety of means, it's been dated pretty solidly to the middle second century, around 150. And it was found in a scrap in Egypt. So now you've got a document that was written far enough back that somebody has copied it at least once, and it has now been discarded as a piece of trash, and it's down in Egypt. So you got to give at least a couple of years for things like that to happen. If you do a search about writing and books in the New Testament, I ran one of those on the NIV version of the New Testament. The word write, writing, written, wrote showed up 180 times. 108 of those 180 times, so only 72 exceptions, are all references to the Old Testament writings. And 42 of those references, so you didn't have but 72, are done in the little letters of John and the book of Revelation. But there clearly were collections of documents by the end of the second Christian century. There were people who mentioned the letters of Paul or the copies of the gospel, plural. So they already know about them in the 200s as collections. Now you don't have the whole Bible, but at least you've got some collections. And this clearly shows up very, very early. In fact, in the book of Luke, very first introduction you have, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of things occurring among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word have handed them down to us. When this book we call Luke was written, the writer already knew about many who have compiled accounts. And that's not exactly the language of verbal or oral documentation. This is the language of documents. And there's many. Is that 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10? He already knows of more than one copy of people who have tried to compile an account of the things about Jesus that have been testified to by eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So he's dealing with documents already. Now, when you go back and look at these quotes, written books in the New Testament, it's clear that the New Testament Christians, as their Jewish predecessors, were familiar with and comfortable with and users of books, written material. Remember the mention I made that for various reasons, the Jews of Jesus' day, particularly the Pharisees, who were the innovators, were high on oral tradition. The oral law given to Moses and transmitted orally, unwritten through the centuries. And so there was clearly a culture of oral tradition. But the references in the New Testament to the Old Testament material are often in the terminology of written that. It's written, didn't they write? Occasionally you get the didn't they say as said by that, but you get this common repetition of references to written material. So the early Christians were perfectly comfortable with, they were regular users of written material. So they don't display this animosity to written. They're not the oral traditionalists who are opposed to this being written down, which persists in a couple more hundred years before they start writing down a lot of this stuff. So we shouldn't be surprised that there were books around. And I was reading just the last couple of weeks a scholar discussing the current field of scholarship on the Gospels. And he asserted unilaterally, without caveat, that the leaders of scholarship on the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in Christian academia, in academia today are comfortable with the idea that even Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John betray written documents. For instance, you got your Bible? Look at, look at Mark chapter 16. And I'll bring it up here. No, I can't do that. I can bring it up for here. Oh, wait, I can too do it. Writing the New Testament. Let's see. I put that on this computer, I thought. Let's see here. Well, I'm, 8 is there too now. Okay. Do you ladies have your Bibles handy? So I can bring one up
Yes,
for people to show here.
Yes.
That you won't be able to see on your text. No, I did it here, didn't I? Last time. Stop sharing that one and share this one. Well, I say I did. Well, maybe, let's see if it did bring this up, didn't it, for you?
Yes.
Okay. And 16. Okay. Oh, when the Sabbath was passed, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Salome brought spices so they might go him, that is Jesus. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb, and they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb? And when they looked up, they saw the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, don't be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He's risen, so he's not here. See the place where they laid him? But go tell his disciples, and Peter especially, that he's going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing, for they were afraid. And then this text has one of the things we're going to look at in a couple of weeks. Some earliest manuscripts stop here. And there's pretty solid evidence that that's a very early version of Mark, and it stopped there. Why would you stop here? Especially when you know about other appearances, the appearances of Jesus to the disciples that validated his resurrection. Why would you stop here? And the answer, because that's where the document you're copying from stopped. You're writing down, you're including in your story of the ministry of Jesus a document that gives you this part of the story, and you're not at liberty because this is written. And so you end where it ends. Yeah, you're not going to elaborate on what has been given to you as the testimony of the resurrection of Jesus. And so you stop. The critical scholar can look at this, and they also then begin to point out that in this text, there are certain phraseologies, words that we haven't seen in the earlier part of the book of Mark, and therefore that reinforces this idea. This is a source that he virtually copies. And so the argument you see is that even the ones that we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are just like and Kings. Remember how many times they said, and aren't the rest of the works of the king, of the prophet recorded in? And then they gave you the book of the wars of, the book of the chronicles of, the book of the kings of Israel, or the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. As though they not only knew this work was there, but may in fact have been relying on it for their basic information. And so the argument is made that the gospel records we have betray the fact that this stuff had already been written down by people, not just orally passed on. That the writers of the Gospels aren't dependent only upon the way the story has been told to them, as told by somebody to somebody to somebody that ended up on their lap. And therefore they simply wrote this down and were therefore somewhat free to phrase it, adapt it, work it, because they're the quote original author, writer of this stuff. That in fact, they were already using documents. Now, this has always, well, I shouldn't say always, for a long time, been an argument about Matthew and Luke in comparison with Mark. Let me stop sharing here and go back to my paper. Oh, it got, no, here it is. I was going to say, this got dropped. I just skipped it. Because of these striking similarities in the order of events, when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they pretty much follow the same arrangement of the stories. They're in the same sequence. And in some places, they're almost identically worded. And they're using the same words, the same phrase even. And so there's always been, well, how do you understand this? And an early solution, of course, is, since Mark is the shorter of the three, and Matthew and Luke have several stories that Mark doesn't mention, that Matthew and Luke used Mark and then added some material that they knew that wasn't in Mark. Well, when you compare the material in Matthew and Luke, not in Mark, you end up again with some of the same stories. And so the conclusion was reached, there was a document. The sayings of Jesus was one of the proposals, because much of that comparison is things he said, not things he did. And so there was this document that somebody had put together on the sayings of Jesus, and Matthew and Luke used it, and they drew from it sometimes different stuff, sometimes the same thing, and added it to their story that elaborated on Mark. And in fact, they eventually got around to calling this document the Q document. I ran into an interesting discussion several years ago where we can't agree on what that Q stood for. There's 2 or 3 different German words that start with Q that would make sense as an explanation of the kind of document this was. And in fact, there are different scholars using each of those. And so the person who was pointing out that here we are with something less than 100 years old that we invented, and we can't agree on what our invention was initially. And here we're talking with great wisdom over something that's 1,000 years old, as though we know how this was done. This synoptic problem of the 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is an impossible puzzle to solve. How in the world do we explain so close and yet all those differences? What's going on? And the simplest explanation, of course, is that each of these 3 people or groups of people were writing at slightly different times, certainly to different audiences. And therefore, they shaped the story in that way. The only problem with that explanation, of course, is none of us scholars can agree on exactly what that is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke as to who this audience is that makes them shape the story this way. But one of the things you really need to watch out for as you read these is that you read the document you're reading in and of itself. And you don't immediately try to bring in from the other documents the rest of the story, so to speak, without seeing what is this writer doing with this story? Where does it fit in his section? How does it add to what he's trying to show about Jesus? And that's way more art than it is science, but it's worth considering. Yeah, and then
because you have a core story, and then you add, and like
yeah,
realize and coming and all that, you know. But I'm just saying, they all, if they talk to people and like, once really.
Yeah.
You said Luke's intelligent, you know, whatever. Well, they all are, but I'm just saying, you know, probably, what was he, a doctor or something, I don't know. Yeah. But anyway, all I'm saying is that he could listen to talk to other people. Like
Sure.
you said, and brought that knowledge, but they're all right.
Yeah, and
So what does it matter?
a part of what the writer brings, you see, may not be the audience that he's writing to. It may be the audience in which he's living.
Exactly.
And so you've got different situations. For those of you that want to see this in play and you don't have it, here's a good source for you to look at. This first one, and it's on this handout that you'll have. This first site is the Gospels in parallel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you have 4 columns. And you have the stories told in a artificial sequence because the sequences are not exact. And so story in Luke shows up earlier in the sequence than it does in the Mark sequence. And so the writer of the compiler of this fourfold thing has to decide in those questionable, which one of these, where does this really fit into an order? So his order is artificial. He's chosen to do it. Now there is a technical version of this that actually takes all 4 gospel records in their sequence. And so the stories that are repeated shows up at different places in the sequence because they don't try to choose. They put the 4 gospels in a line and then they bring in the parallels in each place. And so each one and then so you get the stories told multiple times, which is a little cumbersome, but they did that deliberately so that you would know when you read this story that's also in the other 2 that maybe something different is going on here. Put this in the conjunction with some different stuff than the others did. I could do that a while ago. Let's try this and see if I can get away with it this time. I don't want to translate. You are sharing your screen. I want to stop sharing and I want to go back to sharing this screen. Oops, I did the wrong thing. Stop sharing, share your screen. Nope, wrong thing. I'm sorry. It's this one we want. Yeah. And let's see if I can go up here. Yeah, here we go.
You need an F at the end because you copied everything.
Yeah, I see. There we go. This is what it looks like. And here's your story. And so you can see here's one where it's told twice. And it shows up in both columns. So you can see all the material you have in the New Testament on anything in the gospel. It's there. And then the other one I showed you, I give you 2 links for it, but it's the same thing. And this one, and this is the fourfold gospel where the writer takes the 4 stories and he blends them into one story. Again, he obviously follows an artificial order, one he chose, but this very cleverly in a way that he has in parentheses and brackets and italics and so forth, all the words of all four. So when you're reading the story that he chooses one version of as his basic story, he inserts in that version the wording from each of the other stories. So it makes it a little cumbersome to follow, but you see how the words, the phrases that each writer used at this event. So you can see the whole thing. If you want to take a minute, we can see if we can pull this one off too. Stop sharing this. And go back to this and see if we can get us to bring up another one. Here's the story in Luke where there won't be much of anything because Luke's the only one who tells his story. So let's run on down. The birth of Jesus is told pretty independently, either by Matthew or Luke. So let's run on down here a little ways. Living at Nazareth, that's pretty much only the Luke thing. Okay, now here you see he has Matthew 3, 1 through 12, Mark 1, 1 through 8, and Luke 3, 1 through 18. And he's going to use basically the Matthew story, but see, he has a mark, A, B, and C. So here you can see that in the beginning of the gospel, that's Mark, B. And he adds all kinds of little commentary in here, explanations and all this kind of stuff. The actual text is going to be in bold print. So you could actually go from in the beginning of the gospel of Christ, the Son of God. And you can follow the story. And now you have the whole things blended together. This is a very interesting little thing to have to read when you're reading some of the Gospels. Not only for the way he pulls the text together this way, but then for all his commentary that's built in here. It's a real old book. It's free. You can put this on your computer because I saved it on my computer. And for those of you that may not have found the trick yet, most printer programs now allow you to print a PDF of whatever it was you were going to send to the printer. So if the document won't let you print, won't let you save it, you tell it to print it. And then when you go over, you pick instead of the printer, you pick out a PDF document, and it'll convert it into a PDF document, which you can save on your computer. So you can still get it. But this is an interesting little thing to have. But it's very worthwhile reading. Okay. We can go back to our text now for the night, if I can find what I did with it. Here it is. Okay. So now we're just going to run through the books of the New Testament. It's as easy to follow them by the order we have them in our Bibles as it is to try to show some chronology of their origin, which in very few cases is totally guesswork. There are a few that you can kind of hand down, but most of them you can't. Matthew, of course, was one of the 12. Notice that not an introduction. Even Luke, who's going to say, I've done the same thing, but he doesn't say who I am. So, as we're going to see, that's guesswork too. There is a pretty early tradition. Matthew, the apostle, and the tradition is he wrote this in Hebrew, and then it was translated. Unfortunately, we've never found any solitary piece of evidence that there was a Matthew in Hebrew or Aramaic, which creates a little bit of problem. But that's the tradition. It's quoted by a 4th century, and he quotes Papias, there should be an I in there, who comes from the early part of the 2nd century. He quotes 2 different sources for this, one later in the 2nd century, but he also says it was in Hebrew. He has a different result of it. This Planteus claims that he was aware of this in India, brought there by the Apostle Bartholomew. For those of you who don't know, there is a long tradition by Christian churches in Western India, particularly, that Thomas, the apostle, brought the gospel to them in the 1st century. And there's even some enough pride in that there are some of the Christians in Western India who look a little askance at all of us latecomers to the Christian faith taught by the missionaries of the 19th and the 20th century. We were way, way behind. The critical issue for this is, those of you that are somewhat familiar with it, in Matthew's record, chapter 24, there's an explicit reference to the destruction of the temple, a prophecy of Jesus. There's not going to be one stone left here standing on top of itself. Well, it was written after the temple was destroyed in 70. It's really difficult to perceive how the writer wouldn't have said so. Yeah, and that's exactly what happened, folks, or something to that effect. But there's having happened, like it's still future, which kind of makes it sound like this book might have been a little earlier than that. The book of Mark, which is often assumed to be the first, also has a very early tradition. Again, it's not attributed. The author, there's no writer that puts his name to it. This is just the tradition. And there's even the question of which Mark this is. Is there 2 or is this the same? Is John Mark the same person as the person called simply Mark? And there's disagreement on when he did. Both versions have Mark writing this in conjunction with his ministry with Peter, some of it in Rome. One version says this was done before. One version says it was not done till after he died. And then this Clement of Alexandria, who lived early in the 3rd century, right around 200, wrote a book that we'll see shows up in a couple of copies of the Bible. Shepherd of Hermas, which is another book that we're familiar with, seem to almost quote a couple of places in Mark. And of course, if this one was written first and Matthew and Luke used it, and Matthew had to be written before 70, then obviously you've got to get this book written somewhat earlier. Luke and Acts are clearly written by the same person. He introduces the second book by referring to the former treatise that I wrote. Who this person is derived by looking at the we passages in the book of Acts and comparing references to Luke being with Paul in some of his letters and in the book of Acts, but mainly in his letters, where he gives a greeting at the end of the letter usually, and he'll say, oh, Luke sends his greeting, or do this for Luke or that for Luke, as though Luke is with him, and that would fit passages, kind of a thing. There isn't an early tradition like there was with Matthew and Mark claiming this for him. And one wonders, is that because it was so firmly already established by them that he was this was his record, this is an account, that there wasn't a need to claim it, to reinforce it. It was just understood. I've carefully investigated this. I sent you a piece that is a popular little essay on the credibility of the book of Acts. Which applies then to the book of Luke. Why don't I, if I can, see if I can bring that up. Let's see if I have it on here. Because no, I don't. The number of cities, localities that he mentions in the book of Acts, the number of people and officials that he names, their titles in the book of Acts, is almost inconceivably accurate, as we have found evidence that there was this person with this title. And those were the kind of things that frequently changed. For instance, we have this interesting situation. What are the subdivisions of the state of Louisiana called? Parishes, not counties. Well, the ancient world was the same way. Depending on which country you were in, what the political organization was. Remember, there were Roman cities, there were Greek cities, there were ancient cities that were some were under the Senate, some were under the military. And so officers had different titles, and those would frequently change. And charges have been made against Luke's record by some people, because the thing they knew about this city was that it was a Roman city. Well, then they discovered, well, it wasn't in Jesus' day. And so Luke's mention of all these distinctive things have always proven, when we had solid evidence, to be right spot on, which is a nice claim to authenticity. Acts ends in much the same way Mark ended. Acts, remember, has the major part of the book toward the end, to the end, is the story of Saul who becomes Paul. And it ends abruptly. He's in Rome, in prison, an appearance before the emperor. Well, why end the story there? Unless that's where the story was when Luke wrote this. He didn't write this after Paul was dead. He's writing this probably in Rome with Paul, and they're still waiting for his trial to happen. And for whatever reason, he's written this book for Theophilus, either a real person or a kind of people that he wants them to know about this story. And so it ends where it ends, because that's where they are when he finishes it off to whomever, which would mean it had to be in the middle 60s, because that appears to be when Paul dies. And we're going to see there's an issue there. The fourth gospel record, John, is quite different from the others. There are only, 3 or 4 stories they share. Again, nobody. And you get to John only by this detective work of tracing down the other disciple, the beloved disciple, another disciple that you find in the story, and you finally can, oh, well, this must be John, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, the 4 amigos. There's also a John the Elder, and there's great debate over whether they're the same, how close they were. But the tradition is pretty fixed. In the book of John, you get the idea that you should have gotten in the others when John emphasizes the fact that what he has written is only a taste of what Jesus did and said. There was no attempt to make this complete. They weren't trying to compete with a missionary history of Texas, all 946 pages or whatever it was it turned out to be. And this tradition from Eusebius, that 4th century historian, who quotes Irenaeus having received this from Polycarp, and the tradition is Polycarp actually was a disciple of John. And the book was written in Ephesus, which is one of the cities in the book of Revelation. We mentioned the fact this has very early documentation. A fragment in the mid-2nd century is there. This book, because of its terminology, like the Word, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was divine, was often thrown in the early days of criticism well into the 2nd century, because the terminology like that he uses doesn't show up in other writings that we knew about until the 2nd century. The documents of Qumran have shown that this distinctive terminology of John was around in the days of Jesus. Word, light, water, bread, was already there. There's one outlying translator into English of the Bible who actually believed, he was an 18th century British writer, who believed that John was first. And so in his copy of the Bible, of the New Testament, he puts John, the first book in the Bible, and first book in the New Testament. We've already seen about Luke as the product of Acts, the product of Luke. The letters of Paul, which make up major corpus of the New Testament in number, not in size, all the letters together hardly equal the size of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. So they're not really that long. There's 3 that have a number of chapters. Most of the rest of them are 4 and 5 chapters. They're all marked by whoever wrote the early stuff. In some way or another, he's named, clearly identified in all of these letters. There is some question about some of them, and we'll hold that off till we get there. The book of Galatians, and I switch my order here, and I jump out of order in the Bible to take them somewhat chronologically, will have been the first letter that Paul wrote. The ground for that is that the letter of Galatians is a frontal defense. Church allowing non-Jews to become Christians without circumcision or observance of the Old Testament law. And that is exactly the debate in Acts 15 that produced a letter by the church in Jerusalem to the churches abroad over their decision that they would not, they could not, they should not distinguish their Christian brothers and sisters based on either their previous alliance with the Old Testament or their current alliance to the Old Testament. And it's a little difficult to understand how Paul would have written this letter to anybody and not mentioned the Jerusalem letter. Oh, by the way, guys, I'm not the only one who believes this. The church in Jerusalem wrote this letter. Copy attached. Unless Galatians was written before that decision was made, which means this letter was written before Acts 15. If so, it would be Paul's earliest writing that we've kept. Now, there are scholars who disagree with that, and they feel like that the story in Acts 15 is represented by a brief mention of a meeting by Paul in the letter to the Galatians, and he simply doesn't quote the letter and then their reason depends upon their reason, that they figured out why Paul wouldn't have referenced the letter, even though it spoke directly to the issue. And they're perfectly happy that they've solved the problem, and therefore that they can make the letter later. Depending on what time you play, then it's to whom he gave the letter to. And who the Galatians are is one of the great arguments, because that title it's one of those clear evidences of how things change. The Galatians, actual Galatians, are an ethnic group who moved to Middle Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, very early in Greek history. They're not Eastern Mediterranean people. They're foreigners, early Germanics, most people believe, our ancestors who came across from France and England. And their name gets attached. But then as the Greeks organize and then as the Romans organize, they have different boundaries for this area to which they still attach this name. And the area is different, same kind of issue that Putin's trying to make on Ukraine today. What is really Ukraine and what shouldn't be Ukraine? Well, Galatia had the same problem. If not Galatians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians were certainly Paul's early letters, because they're written to the church at Thessalonica, which arises in the book of Acts. It's the second place Paul goes when he has to leave Philippi. He goes from Philippi to Thessalonica to Berea to Athens in Acts 16 and 17. And the letter clearly shows that he's writing back after he's left there, because he wasn't there but a few weeks. So he's left a very, very young group of Christians there almost on their own. And he's writing back to them about several things that they have questions about. So you're looking at the early 50s when this would have had to have been done. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and here I've simply quoted some of the passages that show this writing process, including the fact that Paul closes the letter writing at least his personal greeting in his own hand. This is the correspondence with the church at Corinth, which Paul goes to on his second journey. And he's now on his third writing to them after he's had this long stay at Ephesus. And this is one of the most intriguing set of books. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, he mentions a former correspondence, as though what Corinthians was really 2 Corinthians. And then in 2 Corinthians, he makes a reference to a very sorrowful, severe writing that he made to the Corinthians, which don't seem to fit any of the material we have. So many believe there was a letter between 1st and 2nd Corinthians, so that 2nd Corinthians really ought to be 3rd Corinthians. And not to be outdone, some scholars believe that the last couple of chapters in 2 Corinthians sound so different that they're really a 5th book, 4th or 5th book that got combined in early manuscripts. But there certainly was 2, and it's pretty hard not to believe there weren't at least 3, and of which we only have 2, for whatever reason.
Already included in the 2 that I have.
Pardon?
It's already included in the.
No, we don't even know what it was. The first letter he wrote to Corinth, we don't even have. We have this reference to it in the first letter we have, but we don't know anything about it except that reference. But as I said, there are scholars who read this reference in the first letter in such a way that Paul's talking about something he said earlier in that letter, not something he said in an earlier letter. I have a little trouble reading it that way, but as we'll see, I have a significantly different vision of the production of the Bible than most people do. Probably because I simply haven't studied it as much as they did. The book of Romans seems to be sent when Paul intends to come to Rome, therefore he hasn't gotten there yet. And that, he said that pretty straightly in the first chapter. So it was probably written as reference in the last chapter while he's on his way to Jerusalem before he gets arrested, which would date it about 56. That follow have several disputes involved in that. The letters frequently called the prison letters because Paul mentions the fact that he's in prison. Philippians, Colossians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians that he mentions there. Where he wrote those, traditionally they're made his time in Rome. where the book of Acts ends. There are a number of scholars who believe they probably were written earlier in that, while he's still in prison in Palestine, before he's sent to Rome. The book of Ephesians, which is the first in our series, way we have it, also has the interesting phenomenon that in some of the early manuscripts, the title is missing. This went to. That's going to be a little bit interesting. And then, of course, you see how you date it depends on which place you put him at. Whether you put him at Caesarea or you put him up in Rome. Colossians seems to be a companion letter. When you read them, you'll see several things where he says basically the same thing. Ephesians 5:19 has that famous passage, don't be drunk with wine, but speaking to one of the psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. Colossians 3:16 has exactly the same phrase in terms of speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. First part and the last part of the verse is different, but that, and when you read through them, you'll see several other where while he's addressing slightly different issues, there's much of the same material. And when you compare them with the letter to Philemon, which is a personal letter from Paul to Philemon about a slave he's met who's a runaway from Philemon, there's pretty good evidence that that Onesimus, who's the slave involved, takes the letter of Philemon back to his owner, and along with it, he takes these letters of Ephesians and Colossians to the neighboring churches. The cities aren't that far apart in Asia Minor, and he takes them there. Look, where did I, oh, it's down here where I put it. Jump ahead here a little bit. To Colossians 4, chapter 4, verse 16. After this letter has been read to you, see that it is also read to the church of the Laodiceans, another one of the Asia Minor churches in the book of Revelation, and that you in turn read the letter from Laodicea. That is the one you would get from Laodicea, the one I'm writing to Laodicea. So there are some that we call Ephesians was really the letter to the Laodiceans. And the name got dropped somewhere along the line. Hence, manuscripts don't have either Laodiceans or Ephesians. And then, for whatever reason, the name Ephesians gets attached to it. If not, then we have Ephesians, Colossians, and Laodiceans, which we don't have. We'll come back to that. Finish up the rest of the books here. The last books that are attributed to Paul, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, the Pastoral Letters, they're often called, pose some historical problems with the book of Acts. 1 Timothy 1 has Paul leaving Timothy in Ephesus. We don't have any record of that in the book of Acts. Titus has Paul leaving, and his going, that is Paul's going, to Nicopolis. The book of Acts doesn't tell us anything about that. And then in 2 Timothy, Titus is in Dalmatia, not Crete anymore. And so for some people, it's a little difficult to fit this into the book of Acts. And so there has been the tradition that when Acts, Paul's in prison, he either gets a hearing and gets released, or he doesn't even have a hearing, he's released. And he travels. He goes to Spain, which he mentioned he wanted to do in the book of Romans. He went to there. And there's even a tradition that he went all the way to Britain. And then he gets rearrested and thrown back into prison, which is when 2 Timothy and Titus are written. And then you don't have to worry about fitting this in, because Paul has done a lot since he got out of prison, leaving Timothy here, Titus there, moving around, going different places, doing different things. And then he gets rearrested. The book of Hebrews is the Enigma in the New Testament. There is, interestingly enough, no solid tradition of who wrote it. It's one of the largest books in the in the New Testament. It's one of the most unique. It is totally unique. There isn't anything else in the New Testament like it in several respects. Even the ancients didn't have any strong views, ideas, tradition, memories about who wrote it. Obviously, Paul is a popular author, attribution, because of the emphasis upon the new covenant and not abandoning the new thing that alludes to the previous covenant. Again, you have the issue that the temple plays a very dominant role in the background of the book. And there's even the terminology with reference to the covenants and the things that the covenant embodied, like the priesthood and the sacrifices, fading away, which is a little difficult to understand. No mention of the temple having been destroyed, if in fact the temple had been destroyed in 70. So one would tend to put this book before 70. Otherwise, why the author wouldn't have said fading away and see, the temple's gone. It's ended and God didn't need it anymore, and so he got it out of the way. There is general consensus that the book was written to more Christians with more Old Testament Jewish background, and the temptation was to leave the Christian faith and go back to their Judaism. While that's popular opinion, you'll find there is some serious question of that and legitimate question of it. But that's what you'll find in the literature. James?
No one ever tried to tie that book, like who could have written it?
Oh yeah, there have been traditions that it was Barnabas, Silas, Paul, of course, is high on the list, but they never take. It's simply this person, it's his opinion that it must have been. And he's not quoting a tradition. He's not asserting a historical fact that he knows. He's voicing his opinion as to who this was, which is really intriguing. We have the book of James, who simply identifies himself as a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. In the apostleship group, there were two Jameses. One we know dies very early in the book of Acts, like chapter 9, I think it is. So not likely that he did it, but maybe he felt it needed to be said very early before he passed away. The other James is so insignificant, nobody hardly would think of that. The most popular James is the James who's listed as one of Jesus' brother. And there is this James, a leader in the church at Jerusalem in Galatians, Paul refers to. And so he's the most popular candidate for having written this book. Hegesippus attributes it to this James, the brother of Jesus, killed by the leaders in Jerusalem early in the 60s, right before, well, probably at the onset of the rebellion.
And the one that dies in the book of Acts, is that John's brother?
That's John's brother. That's James of John, the Zebedean. Then we have Peter's 2 letters. And the tradition is very early that he was the writer of this, in spite of the fact that of all the books in the New Testament, the Greek of the book of 1 Peter is the best Greek of all, even better than Luke, in terms of the precision of the grammar, the vocabulary. That wouldn't necessarily mean that Peter didn't write it, because, remember, it was common to use a scribe. That's why a couple of times Paul mentions the fact, I'm signing this letter in my own hand, because sometimes he didn't even sign the letter. Whoever his scribe was, wrote the letter. And scribes wrote the way they wanted to write. You frequently would have a scribe being used by somebody who's illiterate. So there was no way the person who said, this is what I want you to say, could say, well, I don't want to say it that way. He wouldn't even know how they said it. So that Peter would have used a disciple, a follower, a friend, a paid scribe to write this letter, and therefore would use Greek is not an impossibility. That shouldn't necessarily say anything about the actual authorship, but it means something to a lot of people. Jude is introduced simply as the brother of James. Is this James of James the letter, of James the leadership in Jerusalem? Is this another one of Jesus' half-brothers? And then we have another intriguing situation with Jude. He has a couple of times very close wording to Peter, and then he has a couple of phrases that show up in a couple of books we'll talk more about next week, the Assumption of Moses and Enoch. Now, we mentioned those previously in those books written between the Testament times prior to Jesus that often are classified as the pseudepigrapha. These appear in that list. And then you have the question of, well, is Jude quoting, or are they quoting him? Or are both of them quoting something else that was well known, well read in the day? Now, those, of course, who want to cast the lowest light on books of the New Testament have no problem at all, and forthrightly will claim that Jude is clearly quoting pseudepigraphic material. And he quotes it as though it's, quote, scripture. And therefore, our whole view of scripture needs to be revised. Well, maybe so, but that little doesn't necessarily create a problem. Then we have 3 short letters of John in the book of Revelation, which also claims a John person. And the question is always, is this the John of the gospel? Is this another John, the John the Elder that is mentioned by some people? The book of Revelation particularly, and the opening of 1 John, pretty strongly point to an early follower of Jesus. John 1:1, that which was in the beginning, we have seen with our hands, we've seen with our eyes, we've touched with our hands, we've handled of the word of life. Sounds like somebody who knew Jesus personally. Or is that just glorified language?
Sorry, so is it the John of the book of John?
The tradition, of course, is that this is all the same John. The gospel record, these 3 letters in the book of Revelation are all the same John. Academic scholarship doesn't accept that based on a number of reasons. The most common one, of course, being that the vocabulary is significantly different. Well, the topics are significantly different. So that wouldn't necessarily prove anything. But this has become an increasingly sophisticated argument when you start talking about the distribution of words and that kind of thing. And there's a lot that's been done with that in the last several years with computers who've been able to show that this material is all written by the same person, and here's the profile of the language and the phraseology, and then there's this that some people think he wrote, and man, it doesn't fit at all. Or hey, it does.
To
You
your
know?
point about the scribes, since I guess I was never really
Yes.
thinking about these scribes that these.
Yes.
Like I'm just thinking like, oh, Luke wrote it, Matthew wrote it. If they use scribes, he could have also used.
Of course.
scribes.
And that throws the whole vocabulary thing into a tizzy, because you would have every expectation that Mark and Matthew were not skilled in Greek, certainly literary Greek. You might make the claim, as most people do, that Luke was a very educated man, was a cosmopolitan non-Jew, was very fluent in Greek, and therefore could write well in Greek. But we just mentioned, you see, here's 1 Peter, who even out-Greeks Luke. And Peter certainly would not be expected to be fluent in Greek, except, of course, you see, you still got to remember that he was one of those filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages. So the Spirit can't inspire Peter to write in absolutely excellent Greek. I have no idea what language he spoke that day first.
How does it compare to the other letters though? Because you said 1 Peter.
The 2nd Peter is not near as good a Greek. And that's part of the argument for it's not being the same character, not being the same person. And since the first one doesn't really fit the fisherman Peter, these are pseudepigraphous. There, may have been a close follower of Peter, may have been one of his Timothys who wrote this for him. But as we mentioned, the whole issue of the use of scribes, which we know was common, and Paul certainly reflects it. And the argument has always been that Paul was fluent. Why should we expect there not to be significant literary ambivalence as to the author when you start talking about these books? Okay, so this is what we have. Now the question is, Peter and John of the original 12. Paul, who comes in clearly as a divine choice, number 13. And so he matches now the tribes of Israel, which was 13. Well, what about the rest of these guys? Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, James of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon, Andrew. Never had the need, the desire to write anybody. Barnabas, who was sent by the church at Jerusalem to Antioch to investigate the first non-Jewish church. He didn't write back to Jerusalem anymore. He sets out on his own journeys with Mark when he and Paul can't agree on where they're going to go. He never had any interest in writing anybody. And then, of course, that whole issue we ran into with Paul and Corinth. These documents we have are the only things Paul wrote. Of all the churches he founded, he didn't write back to the Bereans like he did the Thessalonians, whom he had to leave almost as soon as he did the Thessalonians. Never had an occasion to write any of those churches he wrote in Galatia. At some time in his career, he wrote them one letter. He never had an occasion, interest, problem to write any of them again. And so you see, for me, the possibility that there really is a 1 Corinthians that's completely missing is no problem at all. My suspicion is there's a whole bunch of literary product of that early leadership of the Christian faith that existed but didn't get kept. So one of these days we're going to uncover an urn, somebody's basement, and there is absolutely no way that you can avoid the reality that this urn was sealed up in 75 AD, and in it is the book of Romans and 3 other letters that we knew nothing about. And it turns out that this is the letter that Paul signed, so we have his signature now. We know, Luke says, many have set out to do this about Jesus. Where are those? So the New Testament is just like the Old Testament. We know there were a bunch of other things written down. We know that there were the ministries of Elijah and Elisha and numerous other prophets who are both named and unnamed in Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, and we have no book from them. We don't know why. We don't know how. We don't know why we have these. Once the Laodiceans read the Colossian letter and the Colossians read the Laodicean letter, did they do that because they sent the copy from one church to the other? Or did the Laodiceans make a copy and send it to the Colossians? So they kept the copy they had, and the Colossians only had a copy. Now, is it exact? Did it get written down exactly, every single letter? the same. And once the Colossians had the Laodicean letter and their own letter, were they inclined to look around to see if there were some other letters? Did they check with Philippi, although they're across the water, might not have known about them? But what about some of those other cities in Asia Minor? When did a church that got one letter from Paul see one of the other letters he wrote? And how did that happen? And who realized, hey, I know about 3 letters he wrote. Let's see if we can find some more. There's absolutely nothing about how in the world this ever got collected. Who started it? Where did it start? On what premise did they collect these and not those? And what did they think about this material? Was it uniquely authoritative almost from the start? You have some passages like the one that Paul writes, if anyone does not obey our instruction in this letter, take special note and don't associate with them. That sounds pretty authoritative. Did all the churches understand all of this material they got from Paul the same way? And if so, why don't we have the first letter to the church at Corinth or the letter to the church at Laodicea? And we don't know. So as I told you in the first class, how we got the Bible, we don't know. Now, we're going to see next week when we talk about the canon, and the week following when we talk about outside the canon, we see some of these documents being quoted and the lists of them and those kinds of things. But those show that there already was the letters of Paul. What do you mean, the letters of Paul? All we know about are the letters that were written to these individuals. When did they get to be a collection? Okay. That's the emergence of the canon. And we'll talk about that next week, since we're way over time. Time for y'all to go to bed, or to go home at least. I'll send you a little review over this material, and try to get the material for next week to you a little bit earlier, so you have a chance to at least be acquainted with what I'm going to talk about.
Okay.
Any questions?
During that time, I mean, I'm trying to wrap my mind around this, how many people at that time were literate or could write, or, I know, Paul, you said, you know, I had someone doing that for them. But, I mean,
It wasn't a common phenomenon, but it was not uncommon.
It wasn't uncommon, but it was probably, I'm sure the lower class.
The ordinary workers, the farmers, or yeah, they didn't need to, they didn't have any time to read for leisure. They had no need to read professionally. But you would have had a wide range of ordinary entrepreneurs, merchants, craftsmen who operated enough business that they would have to have had some ability to read documents, to validate at least the receipts and the orders and that kind of stuff. So it was not totally uncommon. And you had a definite aristocracy, many of whom.
For instance, someone to write a book because like you're saying, we've only found a couple of books, but there should be others. Maybe they're not, because in those days, I try to place myself.
Yes, and
back in those
there are
days.
those who disagree with me violently, that the canon of the New Testament is all that we have. That's all Paul ever wrote. That's all Peter ever wrote. That's all John ever wrote, were these books that we have in the Bible.
They might not even read those. They have
And-
their name on it.
Yes,
You know what I'm saying?
yes,
So making it more, I would agree with you. It might even be less.
yes.
Because I'm looking at that time.
Yeah, but remember, you're in the days of the Greek writers have already been around for several centuries. The Roman writers are emerging, so you really have already a literary class of people.
Yeah, but then you're saying to people like Paul.
Yes,
that's what I'm saying.
and remember now, you see among the Jews, you have this strong commitment to the written word, the reading of the scrolls on a regular basis. There was a, Yeah. And so, the literary, and that's one of the things that appears to be emerging in this scholarship that I mentioned at the beginning of the class. There seem to be scholars increasingly willing to recognize that while you could still classify the Mediterranean world of the first century as fundamentally oral or verbal, the reality was there were subsets among them that were quite literarily oriented, and the Jews being one of them. That the Jews were already the people of the book. And so it would not have been uncommon at all for a Jew to be able to read.
Right, but, well,
And
I could understand someone like Luke that in the apostles, when you have fishermen and I'm
yes,
not saying lower class, but people
Yes.
that aren't educated. But then that would make me think that they're not running around writing books.
no, and even Paul, you see, some of his work ends up while he's stuck in prison where he can't be doing anything else. So,
They may not be writing.
right, so, my raising the question of how much more did they write that we don't even have is just not even thinkable by a lot of people.
I guess they'd say we haven't.
Yeah, well, and we have,
As long as you-
yeah, we have what we have, and that's part of my understanding of the canon. It's Providence gave us this.
That's why they say God's inspired.
Yeah, we don't really have good explanations for why we have this, and trying to put forth arguments as to why some of this other stuff that we know about didn't get in there. Well, we don't know, but it's just not there.
Yeah. Oh, and people, that's the way we are about everything. We always want to know more,
Yep.
the backstory and all that. They just don't take it for face value. There it is.
Yeah,
They take it, that's it.
We all want to be like Mr. Thomas, and we want to know the rest of the story.
Exactly. And if we don't know, we'll make it up.
Yep. All right, good night.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I had a hard day. I'm going home.
Thank you.
I don't know if we ever went over, a prophet who wrote, but we have no copy in our Bible collection.
I don't think I expressly made a point of that. And so you probably would have missed it. But in that running list of writing in the Old Testament and books in the Old Testament, you will see the mention of the book of, and one of them that sticks out is there is a reference to a book of Nathan, the prophet. And there's not much chance that that's some other prophet than the one we know of, in the ministry of David. And of course, we don't have anything from that prophet in the Old Testament. But he's not the only one. But I didn't make a big deal over that. And I realized that when I copied that out and sent it to you, that's probably going to be a question you all are going to be scratching your heads about,
Yeah.
because I didn't make a big deal over it.
So David was considered a prophet.
David was considered a prophet, but Nathan is named as a prophet, and there is a mention of a book of Nathan the prophet, but we don't have it. And as I said, he's not the only one, but and so, you know, we've got what is it? One of the prophets, Obadiah, is it? One of them is only one page. So here's a prophet we know almost nothing about. The prophecy is not even about Israel. And yet we've got this long career by this man, Nathan, important career, and we don't have his book. Right? Same thing as with these books of the New Testament. Why in the world wouldn't they have kept the book of Nathan? I mean, how much more critical a prophet is there than David, who's very instrumental in the career of David, and he is critically instrumental in seeing that Solomon succeeds David. He's the one who gets David's ear and leads the manipulation. And there are critical scholars who are perfectly comfortable with saying that Solomon becoming the king after David was a coup that Nathan and Bathsheba pulled off because he wasn't the firstborn. There's just no ground on which Solomon should have been in line to become king. But because of the intercession of Nathan, the story says on behalf of Bathsheba, he ends up being king. So here's Nathan, you know, he's vitally important, instrumental in the history and the development of Israel, but we don't have his book. But then there's this guy over here who we've got his book, and he's not even about us.
Yeah.
But they kept it.
Okay. Yeah, that was a hard one.
Yeah,
Well, have a good night.
you too.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
You are
Good
welcome.
night. Good night.
Good night.